You have suffered, not once, not briefly, but deeply, repeatedly, in ways that made you question everything. And every time you brought that suffering to God, the church gave you the same answer. God is testing you. This pain is His plan. Suffer faithfully, and your reward waits in heaven. But that answer never quite satisfied something honest inside you. Because if God is loving, why does suffering feel so purposeless, so random, so utterly without meaning? Carl Jung sat with this question for his entire career, not as a theologian offering comfortable answers, as a psychologist following honest evidence. And what he discovered about suffering was not what the church told you, not what any institution ever told you. Something more honest, more personal, more genuinely useful. So what did Jung actually find, and what does it mean for the pain you are carrying right now? Let me show you.
The church gave you one answer for suffering. God is testing you. Accept your pain faithfully. Offer it up. Your reward waits in heaven. And whatever you do, do not question why. This answer silenced genuine inquiry for centuries because questioning suffering felt like questioning God Himself. But one of Jung's most documented patients, a middle-aged woman he called simply Anna in his clinical records, came to him completely broken. She had followed this teaching perfectly. 20 years of genuine, faithful suffering, accepting every loss, every disappointment, every devastating blow as God's mysterious plan. And she was empty, completely, spiritually exhausted in a way no sermon could reach. She told Jung, "I have accepted everything. I have complained about nothing. I have trusted completely. So why do I feel further from God now than when my suffering began?" Jung sat quietly with her question because he recognized it immediately. It was not a crisis of faith. It was a soul that had been taught to suffer, but never taught what suffering was actually for. So what did Jung discover suffering is actually for?
Jung observed one consistent pattern across decades of genuine clinical work. Suffering always moves in a specific direction, not randomly, not purposelessly, but towards something Jung called individuation, the forced confrontation with your own deeper psychological reality. He documented this carefully. When comfortable life continues without interruption, most people never examine who they actually are. They maintain their persona, their managed surface self, their carefully constructed identity. Then suffering arrives, and the persona cracks. What was carefully managed becomes impossible to maintain. What was successfully suppressed rises unavoidably to the surface. Jung found this moment, as devastating as it felt, was psychologically necessary. Not because God enjoys human pain, but because genuine psychological growth almost never happens in comfort. It happens in crisis. The person who emerges from genuine suffering honestly engaged is fundamentally different from the person who entered it. Not because they suffered, but because suffering forced them to finally meet themselves honestly. Your pain was never punishment. It was an involuntary introduction to who you actually are. So what does this look like in a real human life? She had been the strong one her entire life. 58 years old, 3 children raised, husband buried, church attended faithfully every single Sunday for 40 years. She never cried in public, never complained, never showed weakness. Then her youngest son died unexpectedly, and something inside her that had been held tightly for decades simply broke open. She stopped going to church, stopped praying, stopped performing strength for everyone around her. And in that breaking, For the first time in 58 years, she finally met herself honestly. Jung called this the necessary descent into darkness, the moment the constructed self collapses completely and something more genuine has space to emerge. She told her therapist 6 months later, "Losing him destroyed me, but what came through the destruction was the first real version of myself I have ever known." Jung documented this consistently. Genuine suffering does not destroy the soul. It destroys everything false the soul was hiding behind. So what specifically emerges from that destruction? Stay with me right here, because this is where Jung's discovery becomes genuinely extraordinary. Most people expect destruction to leave emptiness behind, but Jung documented something completely different across decades of clinical work. When the false, constructed self collapses through genuine suffering, something that was always present but never accessible finally has room to emerge. He called it the deeper self. Not a new identity, not a reinvented personality, but the original, authentic core of who you actually are before life taught you to hide it. Think about the woman from part 3. After her son died, after the performance stopped, after the careful management of her image finally collapsed, she discovered something unexpected. Genuine compassion she had never allowed herself to feel. Honest anger she had suppressed for decades. Deep spiritual questions she had been too afraid to ask. And for the first time in 58 years, she brought all of it honestly to God. Not the performed version, not the strong, faithful version, her actual broken, completely honest self. And what she encountered in that honesty was more real than anything 40 years of faithful Sunday attendance had ever produced. Jung said this consistently: God meets you in your destruction, never in your performance. So what does this mean for the pain you are carrying right now? Think about the pain you are carrying right now, not someone else's pain, yours. The specific weight you woke up with this morning, the grief that sits quietly underneath everything, the loss that changed you in ways you're still discovering. Jung documented one consistent truth across decades of genuine clinical work. Pain that is honestly engaged always moves somewhere meaningful. Pain that is suppressed, spiritualized, or simply endured faithfully goes nowhere. It simply waits, growing heavier with every year of avoidance. He observed this in a man he worked with for several years, a retired teacher, 63 years old, who had lost his wife of 30 years to illness. His church told him to trust God's plan, to accept the loss faithfully, to look forward to heavenly reunion. So he did exactly that. For 2 years he performed faithful acceptance and got progressively emptier inside. When he finally stopped performing acceptance and brought his genuine rage and grief honestly into the open, something shifted. Not immediately, gradually, over months of honest, painful engagement. He told Jung, "I spent 2 years accepting her death for God. It took me one honest conversation with myself to actually begin surviving it." Jung said genuine grief, honestly expressed, is not a failure of faith. It is faith functioning exactly as it was designed to. So what did Jung discover about the relationship between grief and God? Jung made one observation that changed everything. The people who encountered God most genuinely were never the ones performing perfect, faithful acceptance. They were the ones who brought their honest, broken reality directly into the open, their rage, their confusion, their devastating, unanswerable questions. He documented this pattern consistently. Genuine encounter with the divine almost never happened during comfortable religious performance. It happened in crisis, in breakdown, in the moments when everything carefully constructed finally collapsed. Think about the biblical figures Jung studied extensively. Job did not encounter God through faithful, silent acceptance. He argued, demanded answers, expressed genuine rage at his suffering directly. And God responded, not to Job's performance, to Job's honesty. David's most profound psalms were not written during peaceful, faithful times. They were written from absolute desperation, genuine terror, raw, unfiltered human pain directed honestly toward God. Jung found this pattern psychologically significant. God consistently meets human beings not in their religious performance, but in their honest human reality. Your grief is not keeping you from God. It may be the most direct path toward Him you have ever taken. So what specific practices did Jung recommend for engaging pain honestly?
Jung was specific about this. Honest engagement with pain does not mean wallowing, does not mean endless self-pity, does not mean abandoning faith. It means stopping the performance of acceptance and starting genuine conversation with what you actually feel. First, practice honest expression. Write exactly what you feel, not what you should feel, not what your church expects you to feel, what you actually feel. Rage, confusion, abandonment, devastating unanswerable questions, all of it, honestly, on paper, directed toward God if that feels right. Jung found this single practice more therapeutically powerful than years of performed faithful acceptance. Second practice, sit with the question honestly, not demanding immediate answers, but genuinely asking, what is this pain trying to show me about myself? One woman Jung worked with described this practice simply. I stopped asking God to remove my pain. I started asking what it needed me to see. Within weeks, she said, it started answering. Third practice, release the performance completely. Stop presenting faithful acceptance to your congregation. Stop performing strength for your family. Genuine healing never begins in performance. It begins the moment you finally allow yourself to be honestly broken. So what does Jung say happens after genuine honest engagement begins? Jung documented this transformation carefully. It does not happen dramatically, not overnight, not in one powerful emotional release. It happens gradually, quietly, in ordinary moments. The retired teacher from Part 5, 2 months after his first honest conversation with himself, noticed something unexpected. He was sleeping better, not because grief had disappeared, but because he had stopped exhausting himself pretending it had not arrived. He started visiting his wife's grave and talking to her honestly, not performing peaceful acceptance, actually talking, telling her he was angry, telling her he was lost, telling her he had no idea how to continue without her. And slowly, something began shifting underneath the grief, not disappearing, transforming. Jung called this the integration of suffering, the point where pain stops being something happening to you and becomes something moving through you toward genuine growth. The grief never fully left him, but it stopped destroying him the moment he stopped pretending it was not there. So what did Jung discover about the final destination of genuine suffering? Jung arrived at one carefully documented conclusion. Suffering, honestly engaged, always moves towards wholeness, not happiness, not the absence of pain, not return to who you were before,
Something more valuable than any of those things, genuine psychological wholeness, the integration of every experience, including the most devastating ones, into a complete and honest human life. He documented this in a woman he worked with for 3 years, a 61-year-old former school teacher who had lost everything simultaneously: her health, her marriage, her sense of purpose. She came to Jung completely shattered. She left 3 years later saying something he documented carefully: "I would not trade my suffering for anything, not because it did not destroy me, it did, but because what rebuilt itself from the destruction was finally real." Jung found this consistently. People who engaged suffering honestly did not become bitter, did not become faithless, did not become broken permanently. They became genuine. And genuine human beings, Jung discovered, have access to a depth of relationship with God that comfortable, undisturbed people never find. So what does this mean practically for your life right now?
Jung never promised suffering would disappear. He promised something more honest, that suffering honestly engaged transforms into something genuinely meaningful. Think about your own pain right now, the specific weight you carry, the loss that changed you, the grief that sits quietly underneath everything. Jung's documented clinical work suggests one consistent truth: that pain is not your enemy. It is an invitation, not the invitation the church offered to perform faithful acceptance until heaven arrives. A different invitation entirely, to finally meet yourself honestly, to bring your complete broken reality directly to God, to stop performing strength for an audience that was never worth performing for. The retired teacher eventually returned to his church, but differently than before. He stopped performing faithful widower, started sitting honestly with his grief during every service. He told his pastor something simple: "I stopped pretending I was fine, and God finally had something real to work with." Jung found this consistently. God does not need your performance. God does not need your faithful acceptance. God needs your honesty. And your pain is often the only thing honest enough to finally deliver it. So what did Jung ultimately conclude about suffering and meaning?
Jung spent decades arriving at one honest conclusion: suffering is not God's punishment, not a test of faithful endurance, not something to be spiritualized into comfortable acceptance. It is the most powerful catalyst for genuine human transformation that exists. He documented this carefully across his entire clinical career. The woman who lost everything at 61, the retired teacher who lost his wife, the 58-year-old mother who lost her son. None of them became whole despite their suffering. They became whole through honest engagement with it. Jung observed something else consistently. People who had suffered deeply and engaged that suffering honestly developed a specific quality he rarely found elsewhere: genuine compassion, not performed Christian kindness, but real understanding of another person's pain rooted in honest knowledge of their own. The retired teacher eventually started a grief support group in his community. He told Jung simply, "My pain finally became useful." Not because it disappeared, because he stopped wasting it on performance. Jung called this the redemption of suffering. Not theological redemption, psychological redemption. Pain transformed from something happening to you into something quietly working through you for purposes larger than your own comfort. So, what is the final truth Jung left us about pain and purpose?
Here is what Jung actually documented. Pain without meaning destroys people. Pain with honest engagement transforms them.
The difference between these two outcomes is not the intensity of suffering, not the duration, not the specific nature of the loss. The difference is one thing only: whether the person was willing to engage their pain honestly or spent their energy performing acceptance of it. The 58-year-old mother who lost her son, the retired teacher who lost his wife, the woman who lost everything at 61, all three found something genuine through honest engagement with their suffering. Not happiness, not answers, not peaceful resolution. Something more valuable. Genuine knowledge of themselves, genuine compassion for others, genuine unperformed relationship with God. Jung called this the gift hidden inside the wound. Not a gift you choose, not a gift that arrives quickly. A gift that only reveals itself when you stop performing around the wound and start honestly sitting with it. Your pain is real, your suffering is real, your grief is real. But so is what waits on the other side of honest engagement with it. Here is final conclusion. Jung recommended 3 specific practices. First, honest expression daily. Every morning, write exactly what you feel. Not what you should feel, not what faith expects, what you actually feel right now. Rage, grief, confusion, unanswerable questions, all of it directed honestly toward God. Jung found this single practice more powerful than years of performed faithful acceptance. Second, ask one honest question daily, not demanding answers, simply asking, "What is this pain trying to show me?" The woman who lost everything at 61 began this practice reluctantly. 3 weeks later, she told her therapist, it started answering. Third, release the performance completely. Stop presenting faithful acceptance to your congregation. Stop performing strength for family. Allow yourself to be honestly broken in front of God. Jung documented consistently that genuine healing begins exactly there. Not in performed acceptance, not in faithful endurance, in honest, broken, genuine encounter with something real. This is SYC Soul, where psychology meets the questions religion was afraid to ask. If this video touched something real inside you, subscribe. New truth every single week. Now, tell me honestly. Drop one word below. Performing, healing, or whole?